Let's look at the bias jumper in more detail. As the name implies, people who are operating at this stage tend to jump to conclusions. And they tend to stack up evidence to support their ideas. In other words, they don't thoroughly analyze alternatives and then decide how they're going to reach a conclusion. Instead, they start with, oh, this is what I think about this, or this is what my friends say about it, and they jump to a conclusion. And then they look for evidence that they can use as arguments for their pre-existing ideas. Because they're busy stacking up arguments for their own conclusions, they tend to ignore or discount contradictory information. I've often seen students write that some people might think this, but, and they immediately discount the alternative viewpoint. Bias jumpers also fail to recognize the quality of different forms of evidence. They often simply assert, this is what I think, and somehow they view that as equal to other forms of evidence. The good news is that because they understand uncertainty, they acknowledge the existence of more than one viewpoint. This is one of the big strengths of this pattern. The problem, however, is that they cannot really take on another viewpoint and describe it and understand it in an objective way. Bias jumpers have made some dramatic improvements over the confused fact finder. But how would they respond to an exam question like the one I mentioned earlier? We were discussing Obamacare, and what if I asked students to discuss the pros and cons? As you will recall, the confused fact finder doesn't discuss pros and cons at all. But what does the bias jumper do? The bias jumper will say, I agree with Obamacare, or I disagree with Obamacare, and here are some reasons why. And they will give you a few, usually not a large number, of valid reasons. So the bias jumper demonstrates better critical thinking. There is some logical reasoning, but a lot of information is ignored. The research in higher education indicates that the majority of students operate as bias jumpers at the time they graduate from an undergraduate program in the United States. In all of the classrooms I have taught at both the undergraduate and master's level at schools in different parts of the world, the majority of students in my own classrooms have demonstrated bias jumper thinking. Here's a picture of how you might visualize this pattern. It's a ladder going into the sky. Bias jumpers often come across as overly confident. They tend to believe they have unlimited abilities to solve problems. After they have practiced and developed skills to argue a position, they tend to be really confident that they know exactly what they're doing. This picture illustrates the idea that there is no limit in their own minds to how well they are doing. Let me have you once again answer a polling question. What proportion of students are you teaching or people you're working with operating as bias jumpers? I am now showing you the results of the poll. Notice that the distribution is shifted to the right. In general, you think that a larger proportion of your students or people you work with are operating as bias jumpers than as confused fact finders. These results make sense. They're pretty consistent with the research in higher education. Now let's look at the transition to the next pattern of thinking. If students are jumping to conclusions and stacking arguments to support pre-existing ideas, then I would argue that they need to work on what I call step 2 skills. And the first of these skills is really, really hard, is to recognize that you are operating as a biased human being. In a classroom, I have often asked students if they had a preference for a position when they started to work on a problem. I like to use the word preference instead of bias because people in general are reluctant to admit that they are biased. I have found that the word preferences does not seem to generate the same reluctance. So I will often ask students when we are discussing a case or other type of analysis if, when they started out, they had a preference for one conclusion versus another. And if the answer is yes, and often the students themselves recognize that the answer is yes, then that opens the door for a discussion about how they might be able to control those biases. The second set of skills is identifying a lot of issues and assumptions and biases associated with different perspectives. In other words, really exploring the problem by looking at it from this point of view and then from that point of view and so on. Really trying, as objectively as possible, to recognize different ways of looking at information. And then logically and qualitatively evaluating evidence. What I have found is that bias jumpers tend to look at a piece of information and say that it either supports my conclusion or it doesn't. Going back to the Obamacare example, we have seen a lot of news stories recently about problems related to the government websites that have been set up for people to sign up for new insurance. If a student is, say, opposed to Obamacare, then the student is likely to cite the website problems as proof that the entire Obamacare program is a disaster. In other words, they tend to reach conclusions that do not display a nuanced evaluation of information. Bias jumpers do not consider whether it is possible to interpret a single piece of evidence in more than one way. The last skill is the ability to organize information meaningfully. Assuming that you have actually done a good job of looking at a lot of information and multiple interpretations from different viewpoints, then what tends to happen is that you have a lot of messy information. Trying to organize that messy information into a meaningful form so that you can make sense out of it and reach conclusions is a difficult thing to do. Altogether, these step 2 skills are very difficult to develop. Based on work I have done with students in different university settings, I believe it might take students as long as 2 academic years of hard work across lots of different courses to develop skills and have them fairly stable. After all of this hard work, people are ready to move to pattern 2, which I call the perpetual analyzer.